The chief surgeon laughed at Dr. Grace Monroe's sealed file, called her unqualified, and ordered her out of his operating room. Then the CIA came through the doors and said the words that froze every doctor in place. "We need Dr. Monroe now." But this is not just a story about a woman being underestimated. It is about the danger of judging quiet people before you know what they survived. Picture a Denver trauma bay after midnight. Rain on the ambulance glass. Blood on white tile. A monitor screaming while a man's pulse slips away. Around the table stand experts with titles, egos, and trembling hands. And in the corner stands the one surgeon nobody trusted. Watch until the end, because the truth behind her silence changes everything. Like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Before those agents ever spoke her name, with the weight of a federal order, Dr. Grace Monroe entered Front Range Memorial Trauma Center, like someone trying not to leave a mark. Denver was gray that morning. Not storm gray, not dramatic, just the tired color of a city that had been awake too long. Snowmelt ran along the curbs in thin black streams. Ambulances rolled beneath the emergency awning with their lights still flashing red and blue, sliding across wet concrete, then vanishing against the glass doors. Inside, the hospital moved with practiced urgency. Phones rang. Elevator doors opened. A janitor pushed a mop bucket around a corner and stepped aside as two paramedics rushed past with a patient wrapped in silver thermal sheets. Somewhere behind a curtain, a woman cried into her hands, while a nurse spoke to her in the low, steady tone people use when bad news has not yet found its final shape. Grace Monroe stood just inside the staff entrance with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a black duffel bag over one shoulder. She wore dark blue scrubs, plain running shoes, and a badge that still looked too new against her collar. Her hair was pulled back tight. No jewelry except a simple watch with a scratched face. No expensive coat, no bright smile prepared for introductions. She looked less like a surgeon arriving at one of Colorado's most respected trauma centers, and more like someone who had learned to travel light because staying anywhere too long was never promised. She paused near the trauma board. Not long, just enough. Her eyes moved across the room, taking inventory in silence. Trauma bays 1 through 4. Airway cart near the north wall. Blood warmer outside bay 2. Portable ultrasound plugged in but angled poorly. Chest tube trays in the lower cabinet. Emergency thoracotomy set behind a glass panel that opened with a key code. She noticed everything. At the central desk, Lila Bennett looked up from a stack of charts. Leela had been charge nurse on that floor for 16 years, which meant she had learned to read people faster than their files ever could. She knew the swagger of surgeons who needed the room to love them. She knew the brittle brightness of residents pretending they were not scared. She knew the silent panic of administrators when real blood showed up before the cameras did. The new doctor had none of that. She stood still but not uncertain, quiet but not timid. Her eyes had the focused patience of someone who expected the room to become dangerous and wanted to know where every exit tool and weakness lived before it did. Lila capped her pen. "You the transfer." Grace turned. Grace Monroe. Lila Bennett. Charge nurse. Grace nodded once. "Good to meet you." Lila waited. Most new doctors filled that space with something. A joke, a credential, a complaint about parking, a small performance of belonging. Grace only set her coffee on the counter and looked toward the supply room. "May I check your airway kits?" Lila stared at her for a beat. "You want to check the airway kits?" "Yes." "You just got here." Grace glanced at the trauma bays. "So did the next patient." Lila almost smiled despite herself. "Supply room is through there. If you rearrange my shelves, I'll know." "I won't rearrange them." Grace picked up her duffel and walked away. Lila watched her go, then looked down at the personnel sheet clipped to her board. Dr. Grace Monroe, trauma surgery, transfer approval, prior overseas emergency surgical service, military medical experience, details restricted under federal authority. There were certifications listed enough to pass hospital review, advanced trauma, critical care, surgical stabilization, disaster response. But the file had strange gaps. No comfortable string of famous hospitals. No glowing fellowship everyone could recognize over coffee. No mentor with a name big enough to quiet a room. At Front Range Memorial, that kind of thing mattered. The hospital liked to think it ran on excellence, and in many ways it did. Its outcomes were strong. Its trauma volume was brutal. Its surgeons were sharp, ambitious, and very aware of who had trained where. The building had a donor wall in the lobby, a research wing with polished glass and conference rooms where people said words like innovation, while nurses downstairs changed blood-soaked sheets. It was the kind of place where skill mattered, but packaging mattered first. Grace did not arrive in the right packaging. By mid-morning, the quiet conversation had started. A resident near the coffee machine said she came from overseas. Another replied, "That's what I heard." "Where overseas?" "No one knows." "That's weird." "Military, maybe." "Then why is her file so thin?" "Some of it is sealed." The first resident gave a small laugh. "Convenient." Grace passed behind them carrying a box of sterile gloves. Neither man realized she had heard. She placed the gloves in Trauma Bay 3, checked the oxygen line, then moved on. Dr. Ryan Keller found her in the supply room 20 minutes later. He was a second-year surgical resident with kind eyes, tired shoulders, and the nervous energy of someone who had not yet decided whether he wanted to become compassionate or impressive. He leaned against the door frame. "Dr. Monroe." Grace was checking expiration dates on cricothyrotomy kits. "Yes, I'm Ryan Keller, one of the trauma residents." She looked up. "Ryan." He smiled, grateful she had used his name. "So welcome to Front Range. It's intense, but good intense, most days." Grace opened another drawer. "That sounds like something people say before it becomes bad intense." Ryan laughed. "I guess that's fair." She checked a laryngoscope blade against the light, then placed it back. Ryan tried again. "So where were you before Denver?" "A few places. Hospitals. Sometimes." He blinked. "Sometimes." Grace closed the drawer gently. "Clinics, field units, temporary surgical sites, like disaster relief." Her face did not change, but something in her eyes moved behind the stillness. "Sometimes." Ryan waited for more. Nothing came. He cleared his throat. "Well, Dr. Shaw runs a tight department. He'll probably want to meet with you before you take anything serious." Grace picked up her coffee from the shelf where she had placed it and took one sip. "Define serious." Ryan smiled weakly. "You know, big trauma, major operative calls, anything that makes administration breathe into a paper bag." Grace looked toward the trauma bay as another ambulance backed in outside. Patients rarely ask whether administration is breathing comfortably. Ryan did not know how to answer that. A voice cut through the room behind him. "No, but surgeons should." Ryan straightened at once. Dr. Everett Shaw stood at the entrance to the supply room. He was tall, silver-haired, and clean in a way that seemed almost architectural. His white coat looked untouched by the hospital around him. His name was stitched above the pocket in navy thread. On the wall outside the main conference room, his photograph hung beside a list of awards, board appointments, and national lectures. He had built Front Range's trauma program into something powerful, and he wore that fact like another layer of skin. Ryan stepped aside. "Dr. Shaw." Shaw's eyes moved past him to Grace. "Dr. Monroe." Grace set down the coffee. "Dr. Shaw." He looked at the open cabinets, the labeled trays, the neat line of supplies she had inspected, and returned exactly as they had been, getting familiar with the department. "Yes. I understand your file is incomplete." Ryan suddenly found a package label fascinating. Grace said, "Some portions are restricted." "By whom?" "Federal authority." Shaw smiled faintly. It was not amusement. It was evaluation. That phrase tends to make administrators nervous enough to stop asking questions. Grace looked at him evenly. "Does it make you nervous?" "No." "Good." The silence sharpened. Shaw stepped into the supply room. "This department runs on standards, Dr. Monroe. clear credentials, clear authority, clear chains of command. Grace said, "That sounds useful. It is necessary. So is judgment." His smile disappeared. "Judgment is earned here." Grace held his gaze. "Where I learned it, it was earned too." Ryan looked between them, wishing the floor would open politely and let him leave. Shaw studied her face, searching for something he could name. Arrogance, defensiveness, fear. He found none of them, and that seemed to irritate him more. "I'll be observing your first shifts closely." Grace nodded. "I assumed someone would." "Good." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. Front Range is not a place for improvisation." Grace picked up a sealed airway kit and placed it back in the drawer. "Then I hope your protocols are fast." Shaw looked back. "They are." Grace said nothing. He walked away. Ryan released a breath he had apparently been holding. That could have gone better. Grace lifted her coffee. "It also could have gone worse. You don't seem worried." She looked toward the ambulance doors again. "I try to save worry for things that bleed." The first real test came before lunch. A construction worker in his 50s arrived after falling from scaffolding at a downtown renovation site. His name was Martin Ellis. His hard hat came in on his chest. His left shoulder sat at the wrong angle, visibly dislocated. Dust clung to his beard. Sweat shined across his forehead. The paramedic report came fast. Fall from about 12 feet. Landed on left side. No loss of consciousness. Shoulder deformity, complaining of chest tightness. Pressure 100/70, heart rate 120. Ryan moved to the bedside. "Looks like shoulder and ribs. Let's get pain control and films." Martin groaned. "Feels like I can't get air." A nurse reached for oxygen. Grace stepped to the side of the bed. She did not touch him at first. She watched. His breathing was shallow, but the pattern was wrong. His right chest lagged by half a second. His neck veins were not obvious, but they were fuller than they should have been. His fingers gripped the sheet in rhythm with each breath. Grace leaned closer. "Martin, look at me." His eyes found hers. "You fell on your left side." He nodded, jaw clenched. "Yeah. Where's the pressure?" He lifted a trembling hand toward the center of his chest, then shifted it right. "Here. More here." Ryan frowned. "Could be pain splinting." Grace said, "Listen to the right side." Ryan hesitated, then placed his stethoscope. His face changed. "Breath sounds are decreased." Grace turned to Lila, who had already stepped closer. "Portable chest film. Chest tube tray ready. Large bore access. Keep him on the monitor." Ryan looked up. "Should we call Dr. Shaw?" Grace's eyes stayed on Martin. "Call him. Do not wait for him." Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it. Lila moved. That made everyone else move. The portable film arrived quickly. The image confirmed what Grace had already seen. Right pneumothorax growing. Not yet catastrophic, but headed there with the calm certainty of a door closing. Martin's breathing worsened while the tray was opened. His face had gone gray at the edges. Grace pulled on sterile gloves. "Martin, I need to put a tube into your chest to let the air out. You'll feel pressure. I'm going to talk you through it." Martin's eyes widened. "Am I dying?" Grace met his fear directly. "Not if we do this now." Shaw entered as she was prepping the site. "What do we have?" Ryan turned quickly. 53-year-old male, fall from scaffolding, right pneumothorax. Dr. Monroe is placing a chest tube. Shaw looked at the image, then at Grace. Was he unstable? Grace did not stop moving. He was becoming unstable. "That is not the same thing." Grace injected local anesthetic. Martin flinched. She spoke to him, not Shaw. "Breathe with me. In through your nose. Good. Hold still for the pressure. You're doing fine." Shaw stepped closer. "We could have confirmed with additional imaging." Grace made the incision. He confirmed it by not breathing. The room went quiet. Lila watched Shaw's jaw tighten. Grace worked with controlled efficiency. No wasted motion. No flourish. She opened the space, guided the tube, and advanced it. Air hissed out with a sharp, ugly sound. Martin took a deeper breath almost immediately. His shoulders lowered by an inch. Color began returning beneath the dust and sweat. Grace secured the tube. Better. Martin closed his eyes. Yeah, God, yeah. Grace nodded to the nurse. Repeat film, watch output. Pain control once he's settled. She peeled off her gloves and dropped them into the bin. Shaw stared at the patient for a moment longer than necessary. Then he followed Grace into the hall. You move fast, he said. Grace stopped at the sink and began washing her hands. Sometimes fast is on time. He stood beside her, close enough for authority, not close enough for conversation. You need to understand something. I have seen surgeons mistake confidence for competence. I have seen speed turn a manageable case into a disaster. Grace dried her hands carefully. I have seen delay do the same. His eyes narrowed. This is not a field station. The paper towel stilled in her hands. For the first time since he had met her, something almost visible passed across her face. Not anger exactly. Recognition. Like a person hearing a familiar sound from a place they had tried to leave behind. No, she said quietly. It has better lighting. Shaw waited for more. Grace threw the towel away and walked back toward the trauma bay. He watched her go, and his dislike became more organized. By late afternoon, the department had begun forming opinions. That happened quickly in hospitals. Faster than lab results, faster than discharge paperwork, faster than apologies. Some nurses liked Grace because she did not waste their time. She gave direct orders and noticed when they anticipated correctly. She said thank you without making it sound like charity. Some residents disliked her because she had a way of seeing the right answer before they had finished explaining the wrong one. A few attendings called her sharp, which in medicine could mean gifted, difficult, or female in a way that made men uncomfortable. Lila kept her own counsel. She watched Grace eat half a protein bar between patients standing beside a medication cart because she did not want to occupy a chair someone else might need. She watched her rewrite a discharge instruction sheet in simpler language for a patient who was pretending to understand medical terms he clearly did not. She watched her pause outside a family consultation room before entering, not to gather courage, but to remove something from her face before the family saw it. Near 7, Lila found her in the break room staring at the vending machine. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. The room smelled of burnt coffee and microwave soup. Lila stepped beside her. You planning to negotiate with it? Grace looked at the rows of chips and candy. I'm assessing risk. Of almonds. Of choosing badly. Lila put $2 into the machine and pressed a button. A bag of trail mix dropped. She handed it to Grace. Welcome to night shift nutrition. Grace accepted it. Thank you. They sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the mountains were dark shapes against a bruised evening sky. The city lights had begun to come on below them. For a while, neither woman spoke. That suited both of them. Finally, Lila said, "You don't talk much." Grace opened the trail mix. People say that when they want someone else to talk more. That is generally how the sentence works. A faint smile touched Grace's mouth. It was small enough that someone less observant would have missed it. Lila leaned back. Military. Grace looked out the window. Once. Army. Grace took a few seconds. Among other rooms. That is not an answer. No. Lila studied her. You always this careful? Grace turned the bag in her hands. No. The answer landed heavier than Lila expected. Before she could ask anything else, the overhead speaker crackled. Trauma team to Bay 2. Incoming motor vehicle collision. Trauma team to Bay 2. Grace stood at once. The stillness vanished not into panic but into purpose. Lila rose with her. You finish the trail mix later. Grace folded the top of the bag neatly and put it in her scrub pocket. If later behaves. It did not. The motor vehicle collision turned out to be less severe than dispatch had suggested. A young driver with a broken wrist, a scalp laceration, and more fear than blood. Grace let Ryan lead, corrected his splint angle once, then stepped aside. She did not need to own the room when the room did not require her. That detail mattered to Lila. Ego always tried to remain visible. Grace disappeared whenever she was not needed. At the end of shift near midnight, Grace left through the staff exit into the cold Denver air. Her apartment was 20 minutes away in an old brick building above a closed print shop. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and someone else's cooking. Her unit was small and mostly undecorated. She placed her keys badge and trauma shears on the kitchen table in a precise line. The movement was automatic. Keys, badge, shears, phone. She took off her scrub top and rolled her left shoulder once. In the bathroom mirror, she looked older than she had under hospital lights. Not older in years, older in distance. When she pushed up her sleeve, an old scar showed along the inside of her forearm, pale against her skin. She ran water over her hands, though they were already clean. For a moment, she was somewhere else. A generator coughing in the dark. A medic shouting for blood. Dust moving across a surgical light. Someone praying in a language she did not speak. A young man asking whether his legs were still there. Grace shut off the water. The apartment returned around her. Quiet walls. Denver traffic below. The refrigerator humming like nothing in the world had ever exploded. She changed into a gray shirt and sat at the small kitchen table without turning on the television. Her phone buzzed once. A hospital email. Welcome packet. Mandatory compliance reminders. Orientation forms. She ignored it. Outside, a siren passed faintly in the distance, rose between buildings, then faded. Grace looked toward the window until the sound was gone. The next morning, she arrived before her scheduled time. Lila found her in Trauma Bay 1 checking the seal on the chest tube tray she had used the day before. "You know, supply checks are not technically your job," Lila said. Grace did not look up. "I know. Then why are you doing it?" Grace replaced the tray. "Because the lung does not care whose job it was." Lila laughed softly. "Dr. Shaw is going to hate that answer." Grace picked up her coffee. "I suspect Dr. Shaw already has a hobby." Across the room, Shaw had entered unnoticed. He heard enough. His expression did not change, but his eyes did. Ryan appeared at the desk, still half awake, holding a chart. "Morning," he said. No one answered immediately because the ambulance radio began to crackle. Front Range Medic 14 inbound. Male patient estimated 38 penetrating abdominal injury, hypotensive, altered mental status. 5 minutes out. Lila reached for the trauma board marker. Grace set down her coffee. Shaw stepped forward. "I'll oversee this one." Grace glanced toward the ambulance doors. The city beyond them was bright with cold morning light, but the sound coming through the radio had already changed the air in the room. She pulled on gloves. "Then let's be ready before he arrives." The ambulance arrived 3 minutes later instead of 5. The bay doors opened with a wet rush of cold air, and 2 paramedics pushed the stretcher in fast enough that the wheels screamed against the tile. A man lay strapped beneath cut fabric and blood-soaked gauze, his face waxy under a smear of rain and soot. He looked late 30s, maybe early 40s. No wallet, no phone, no name. Just a dark shirt sliced open down the middle, and a wound low in his abdomen that had already soaked through the pressure dressing. Found in an alley off Colfax, the lead paramedic said breath tight. Possible gunshot. No ID. Police not on scene when we loaded. Pressure 86 palp. Heart rate 140. He's been in and out. Grace moved with the stretcher. Any exit wound. Not that we found. Fluids. Started en route. No response. The man's eyes fluttered open for half a second. They were pale blue, unfocused, and far too calm for the amount of blood he had lost. Grace leaned close. "Can you tell me your name?" His lips moved. No sound came. Ryan reached for the trauma shears. Shaw stood at the foot of the bed, already taking control. Airway intact. Get labs type and cross portable chest and abdomen. We'll scan once he is stable enough. Grace placed 2 fingers against the man's wrist, then moved to his abdomen. She pressed lightly, then deeper. The body answered before any image could. Rigid, distended, guarded in the wrong way. Blood did not always announce itself honestly. Sometimes it hid in the spaces a surgeon learned to fear. Grace looked at Lila. "Activate massive transfusion. Call OR." Shaw turned. We are not skipping imaging. He will not survive the trip. You do not know that. Grace lifted her eyes to him. I know enough. The monitor showed a pressure that slid lower while they spoke. Ryan swallowed. 72 systolic. Lila had already picked up the phone. Shaw's voice sharpened. Lila, hold that call. Lila froze with the receiver near her ear. Grace did not look away from Shaw. His abdomen is filling. If we scan him, we photograph the reason he dies. The room tightened. Shaw stepped closer, speaking low enough that only those nearest could hear. You do not override me in my trauma bay. Grace's answer came just as low. Then stand where you can see the monitor. For 1 second, no one moved. Then the patient gave a weak cough, and fresh blood pushed through the dressing in a dark wave. Lila spoke into the phone. Or one, now. Shaw looked at her. Lila looked back. No apology lived in her face. The stretcher moved. Ryan helped push his knuckles pale on the rail. Grace walked beside the patient, one hand over the dressing, feeling the pressure pulse beneath her palm. Shaw followed 2 steps behind, fury held in the hard line of his mouth. Inside. Or one, the room snapped into shape around the patient. Gown, gloves, prep, drapes, blood products coming through the door. The anesthesiologist took the airway. Lila stood at Grace's right before anyone officially assigned her there. Grace scrubbed fast, but not carelessly. Her hands moved through ritual with a precision that seemed older than the room. Shaw entered as she stepped to the table. I am taking lead. Grace looked at the blood spreading beneath the drape. You can take lead when the bleeding stops. She made the incision. The abdomen opened into heat blood and the metallic smell of time running out. Ryan stood opposite her, eyes wide above his mask. Lila passed suction before Grace asked. The field cleared in pieces. Grace packed quickly. Left upper quadrant clear enough. Right upper no. Pelvis is worse. Shaw watched from the edge of the field. Slow down. No. Dr. Monroe. Not now. Her hand went deeper. She followed the wound path through torn tissue and clotted blood, then paused. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. There. She clamped. The bleeding changed. Not stopped, changed. The wild flood became a controlled threat. Ryan exhaled so hard his mask shifted. Grace said, more light. Lila lap pad. Ryan, hold here. Do not drift. Ryan obeyed. His hand trembled once. Grace saw it without looking at him. Breathe through your nose. Your hand follows your breath. He steadied. Shaw's eyes flicked to Ryan, then back to Grace. The operation lasted less than an hour, though later Ryan remembered it as both shorter and longer. Grace found the torn vessel, repaired what she could, controlled what she had to, and left nothing theatrical behind her. No speeches, no flourish, no victory. Only the monitor less angry than before. Only the patient alive beneath the lights. When they rolled him toward recovery, still unidentified, Shaw met Grace in the corridor outside the scrub sink. His cap was in one hand. His face had gone pale under the anger. What exactly do you think happened in there? Grace removed her gloves. A man did not die. You had no authority to open him. He had no pressure. You made a unilateral operative decision in my department. Grace looked at him then, and something in her expression cooled. You made a delay. I made a correction. Ryan, passing behind them with a chart, slowed without meaning to. Shaw saw him and lowered his voice. This is not a combat tent. The words landed. Grace's face changed for less than a second, but Lila saw it from across the hall. A door opened somewhere inside Grace and shut again before anyone could look through. No, Grace said. The floor is cleaner. She walked away. The story spread before the patient reached the ICU. It did not spread as fact. Hospitals rarely did that. It spread as versions. Grace had cut without permission. Grace had saved a patient Shaw wanted to scan. Grace had ignored the chain of command. Grace had seen something no one else saw. By noon, people had chosen their preferred version based mostly on what they already wanted to believe. In the physician's lounge, a senior anesthesiologist said, "She was right about the abdomen." A vascular fellow replied, Being right after the fact does not mean the process was sound. A nurse at the counter said he was bleeding out. The fellow shrugged, and if she had been wrong, the nurse stared at him. If she had waited, he was dead. That ended the conversation for almost 10 seconds. Grace heard none of it, or pretended not to. She finished notes checked on Martin Ellis from the day before and stopped by the ICU to look at the unknown gunshot patient through the glass. He lay under sedation, chest rising with the ventilator. Tubes, lines, dressings, no name band beyond temporary numbers. Leela came up beside her. Still no ID. Grace watched the monitor. He is trained. Lila looked over. What? His hands. The man's hands rested at his sides, bruised and still. Grace nodded toward the right one. Old calluses. Not construction. Not Jim only. Trigger finger rope friction healed fractures. Someone taught him pain was background noise. Leela studied the patient again. You got all that from his hand. Some of it. And the rest. Grace turned away. Pattern. Lila followed her into the hall. You see a lot of patterns. Grace said nothing. That became the rhythm of the next 2 weeks. Patients arrived, broken. Frightened, bleeding, burning, gasping, lying about pain because fear made people proud in strange ways. Grace moved through them with a calm that did not soften the danger, but gave it shape. A snowboarder came in from the mountains, laughing too loudly after slamming his head on ice. He insisted he was fine. His girlfriend cried beside the bed and said he kept repeating the same question in the car. Ryan began the standard concussion exam. Grace stood behind him and watched the patient's eyes. Ask him to look left again. Ryan did. One pupil lagged. Barely. A small betrayal inside a smiling face. Grace turned to Lila. CT now. Neurosurgery on standby. The snowboarder groaned. Come on, Doc, I just need stitches. Grace leaned over him. You need to stop negotiating with a brain bleed you cannot feel yet. The scan proved her right. Another day, a woman collapsed outside the elevators while being transferred from labor and delivery. The hallway filled instantly. Voices rose. Someone shouted for OB, someone else called anesthesia. The woman's oxygen saturation fell, while hands and bodies crowded around her. Grace lowered herself to one knee beside the stretcher, moved the woman's shoulder, adjusted her airway, and changed the mask seal. Everyone not touching the patient stepped back. No one moved. Lila raised her voice. You heard her. Back. Space opened. The woman drew in one better breath. Then another. Grace kept her voice steady. Stay with me, Dana. You are not falling. You are on a bed. Your baby is not the work right now. Breathing is the work. The woman's terrified eyes fixed on her. OB arrived to find the panic already narrowed into a plan. A little boy with a crushed hand came through after a garage door accident. He was 8 years old and furious with pain. He kicked one resident in the thigh and tried to bite another. His father kept saying, "Be brave, buddy," which only made the child scream harder. Grace crouched beside the stretcher. What is your name? The boy glared at her. Eli. Eli, you do not have to be brave. He blinked, confused mid-sob. Grace held up one gloved finger. You can be scared. You can be angry. You can hate everyone in this room. But I need 10 still seconds from this hand. I can't. You can. It hurts. I know. His chin trembled. Grace's voice lowered. Look at me, not your hand. He did. She nodded once to Ryan. They set the splint. Eli screamed, but he did not move. Afterward, his father whispered thank you. Grace only said, stay near his face. He trusts you more than us. Then she moved on. That was the part Shaw could not organize into a clean complaint. Grace was not reckless in the way he understood recklessness. She did not chase attention. She did not grandstand. She did not embarrass residents for sport. She did not enjoy being right. She simply kept being right in rooms where he had not given her permission to be. At the weekly surgical staff meeting, Shaw decided to make the problem public. The conference room was full by 7:30, surgeons with coffee, residents with notebooks, department heads pretending not to check their phones. A screen at the front displayed case metrics and quality indicators. Grace sat near the far end of the table with a black coffee and a closed notebook. Lila stood against the back wall because nurses were invited to these meetings only when someone remembered that the hospital could not function without them. Shaw moved through the agenda with calm efficiency. Mortality review, resource allocation, trauma response times. Then he changed slides. Credential review and operative authority. Several people shifted in their chairs. Shaw looked down the table. Dr. Monroe, perhaps you can clarify something for the department. Grace lifted her eyes. Yes. Your transfer file contains multiple restricted sections. Your listed stateside operative history is limited. Your overseas work is described in broad terms without conventional institutional verification. The room became very still. Ryan looked at the table. Lila's jaw tightened. Shaw continued. Yet you have repeatedly assumed authority in acute settings, including operative intervention, without prior attending approval. I believe this department deserves to understand where exactly you acquired the judgment you keep asking us to trust. Grace rested one hand on her notebook. Field hospitals. Shaw gave a thin smile. Where? Several places. Names would help. Not always. A few people looked up. Shaw leaned back. How convenient. Grace watched him. The room waited for embarrassment to do what it usually did. Force explanation. Force defense. Force the quiet person to perform pain for approval. Grace did not perform. She closed her notebook. I did not realize survival required a witness. The sentence landed without heat, which made it worse. She stood. Shaw's face hardened. Dr. Monroe, this meeting is not over. Grace looked at him. For you, maybe. She left the room. No one spoke until the door closed. Lila followed 30 seconds later. She found Grace at the vending machines in the hall, not buying anything, just standing in front of the glass as if the rows of snacks gave her somewhere to put her eyes. That was ugly, Lila said. Grace did not turn. It was a meeting. You know what I mean? Grace looked at the reflection of the conference room door behind them. He wanted a confession disguised as a resume. Lila softened. And what did you want? Grace took a long breath through her nose. A shift where nobody asked me to translate old blood into modern language. Lila said nothing for a moment. Then from inside the conference room, muffled voices rose and fell. Grace picked up her coffee from the small table nearby. Bay 3 needs a dressing change. You are off service for the next hour. The dressing is not. She walked away. The call came just after dusk the following evening. A black SUV led the ambulance convoy into the bay, which immediately changed the mood of the department. Security moved before anyone told them to. An administrator appeared from nowhere, smoothing her jacket with one hand while holding her phone in the other. The patient was 17-year-old male, trapped in the back seat after a high-speed collision near downtown. Internal bleeding suspected, facial lacerations, pelvic trauma, son of Mayor Daniel Price. Cameras had already gathered outside. Shaw arrived before the stretcher cleared the ambulance doors. I'll take this case. No one questioned him. High-profile patients attracted high-profile doctors. It was an old rule, rarely written down. The boy's name was Noah Price. His face looked younger than 17 beneath the blood. His lips were pale. His breathing came in shallow bursts. His security detail hovered until Lila sent them back with a look that made arguing seem unwise. Grace stood near the foot of the bed and watched the first assessment. Shaw was good. That was the truth, and Grace never denied truth because it was inconvenient. His hands were trained, his mind was fast. He knew trauma. He gave orders cleanly, and the team responded. But he carried something extra into this case. Visibility. The mayor. The cameras. The board. The donors. The kind of attention that made every decision echo beyond the body on the table. Noah's abdomen tightened under exam. His pressure dipped. Shaw made the call. OR. Grace did not object. She watched them go. 15 minutes later, she stood in the observation gallery above OR2 with Lila beside her. Below, Shaw worked quickly. The field opened. Blood appeared, but not wildly. He searched, packed, suctioned. His posture remained controlled. Then Noah's pressure dropped again. The anesthesiologist called the number. Shaw reached higher. Grace stepped closer to the glass. No. Lila looked at her. What? He is chasing the wrong pocket. Below, Shaw ordered more suction. The nurse adjusted. The blood kept coming. Grace's eyes tracked the field. Lower mesenteric branch. The path shifted on impact. Lila's voice was quiet. Can he find it? Grace did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. The monitor alarm sharpened. Shaw's shoulders changed. It was subtle. A tightening beneath the gown. The first physical sign that certainty had become effort. Grace turned. Lila caught her arm. Grace. Grace stopped. Lila's grip tightened. He will burn you for this. Grace looked down through the glass at the boy on the table. He can do that when the boy has pressure. She went through the door. Inside the OR, the circulating nurse looked up in surprise. Grace was already at the scrub sink. Shaw saw her reflection in the glass cabinet. No. Grace pulled on a gown. Shaw's voice rose. This is my case. Grace stepped to the edge of the sterile field. Then save him. The sentence cut through the room. Noah's pressure dropped again. Anesthesia said 58/30. Grace pointed. Retract lower. Suction under the pack. Clamp ready. Shaw stared at her. Get out. Lila stood at the doorway, silent. The scrub nurse looked from Shaw to the monitor, then to Grace. Another alarm sounded. Grace spoke again. Lower, now. The nurse moved. Not because Grace had authority on paper, because the patient had less than a minute of patience left. Shaw swore under his breath and shifted the field. Fresh blood welled from exactly where Grace had indicated. For half a second his eyes betrayed him. Surprise. Then anger at the surprise. Grace held out her hand. Clamp. The instrument landed in her palm. She placed it cleanly, controlled the vessel, and tied the repair with movements so economical they seemed almost quiet inside the noise. The numbers began to climb. Not enough for comfort. Enough for life. She checked the surrounding tissue, gave 3 instructions for closure, and stepped away. Shaw stared at her over the drape. His mask hid his mouth but not his eyes. Grace removed her outer gloves. He needs careful monitoring for bowel perfusion. Do not let the optics rush closure. Then she left. By morning, Noah Price was alive in the ICU. The hospital released a careful statement about rapid surgical response and ongoing recovery. The mayor thanked Front Range Memorial publicly. Cameras recorded Shaw walking through the corridor beside administrators. Grace's name appeared nowhere. She seemed relieved. Shaw was not. At 9:15, Grace received a message. Report to Dr. Shaw's office. Lila was already there when Grace arrived. That told her enough. Shaw's office looked like a room built by someone who believed achievement needed witnesses. Diplomas in exact alignment. Awards under glass. A framed photograph of Shaw shaking hands with the governor. Books arranged by size more than use. The city visible through tall windows behind his desk. Shaw remained seated when Grace entered. Closed the door. Grace did. Lila stood near the wall, arms folded. Shaw placed a document on the desk and slid it forward. Administrative suspension pending review of credentials and conduct. Lila pushed off the wall. Everett. He did not look at her. Grace picked up the document. Her face stayed unreadable as she read. Shaw spoke with the careful rhythm of a man turning anger into policy. You entered an operating room where you were not assigned, interfered with the attending surgeon of record, and demonstrated a pattern of unilateral decision-making that creates unacceptable institutional risk. Grace lowered the paper. The patient survived. That is not the only issue. It is the first issue. No, Shaw said, voice hardening. The first issue is that this hospital cannot function if every physician decides her instincts matter more than structure. Grace looked at the diplomas behind him. Structure did not find the bleed. His jaw flexed. This is exactly the attitude I am referring to, Lila said. She was right. Shaw turned to her. "You are here as witness, not advocate." Lila's eyes went flat. "I can do both." Grace placed the paper back on the desk. Shaw pushed a pen toward her. "You are removed from clinical duties pending board review. You are not to enter patient care areas unless explicitly cleared." For the first time, Lila saw something like fatigue move through Grace's face. Not defeat, something older. Grace picked up the pen. Lila stepped forward. "You can contest this." Grace looked at her. "Will it change the decision?" Lila glanced at Shaw. No one answered. Grace signed. Her signature was precise, dark, and steady. Shaw seemed almost offended by the absence of protest. "You understand the seriousness of this." Grace set the pen down. "I understand the document. That is not what I asked." "No," Grace said, "it isn't." She turned toward the door. Shaw's voice followed her. "Dr. Monroe." She stopped. He stood now. "You are not the standard here." Grace looked back. For a moment, the office felt smaller than before. "No," she said quietly, "I am not." She opened the door and left. Lila followed her into the hall. Grace walked to the physician locker room, opened her locker, and began removing the few things inside. A spare scrub top, a trauma shears holster, 2 medical texts, a protein bar, a coffee mug with no design on it. No family photos, no postcards, no proof that she had expected the place to become hers. Lila stood beside the bench. "You saved his life." Grace placed the books in a small cardboard box. "Then he can grow up and be annoyed by his parents. That is a decent outcome. Do not make this small." Grace paused. Her hand rested on the edge of the locker door. "I am not making it small. You are leaving like this is nothing." Grace looked at the nearly empty locker. "I have left worse rooms with less." Lila's expression softened. "Who are you, really?" Grace closed the locker. The metal click sounded final. She held the cardboard box against her side. Someone who hoped this place might be simpler than the last one. She walked out through the staff corridor. People saw her carrying the box. Conversations dimmed as she passed. Ryan stood near the nurse's station, guilt visible on his face, though he had done nothing wrong except be young inside a system older than him. "Dr. Monroe," he said. Grace stopped. He swallowed. "I'm sorry." Grace looked at him for a second. "Learn faster than the room teaches you." Then she continued toward the exit. That evening, Lila stayed late. The department settled into the strange quiet after a hard day. Not true calm. Hospitals never had that. Just a lull in which machines hummed, charts waited, and everyone pretended the next disaster had not already begun somewhere else. Lila sat at a workstation under dim blue light and opened Grace's personnel file again. She told herself she was checking dates. That was not true. She scrolled slowly through the standard entries. License, training, certifications, transfer approval, immunization record, emergency privileges, then the restricted section. Most of it was blank behind access denial messages. But near the bottom half, buried beneath administrative codes, one line appeared in plain text. Service record sealed under federal authority. Joint Special Operations Medical Command. Contact restricted. Lila stopped breathing for a second. She read it again. Joint Special Operations Medical Command. The words made the room feel colder. Behind her, a resident laughed too loudly at something near the coffee machine. A patient coughed behind curtain 6. Somewhere down the hall, a family member asked for another blanket. Ordinary hospital sounds. Lila stared at the line on the screen and thought of Grace's face when Shaw said combat tent. The way her eyes had changed. The way her hands never shook. The way she looked at bleeding not as a surprise, but as a language she had learned young enough to hate. A low vibration rolled through the window glass. Lila looked up. At first she thought it was thunder. Then every phone at the nurse's station lit up at once. Emergency alerts began to chime across the department, one after another, until the sound became a thin electronic panic. Lila picked up her phone. The message filled the screen. Explosion reported near downtown Federal District. Avoid area. Multiple casualties expected. For 1 second, no one moved. Then the ambulance radio cracked to life. The ambulance radio crackled again, louder this time, as if the voice on the other end had been pushed through smoke. Front Range, this is Denver Dispatch. Multiple units inbound from downtown Federal District. Explosion near the records annex. Unknown cause. Unknown number of casualties. Prepare for mass casualty intake. For 1 second, the trauma floor held still. Then it broke into motion. Lila stood from the workstation so fast the chair rolled backward and struck the wall. The line on Grace Monroe's file still glowed on the screen behind her, but the hospital had no time for secrets now. Open trauma. 3 and 4. Lila called. Clear hallway beds. Call blood bank and tell them massive transfusion surge. I want airway carts checked, burn sheets pulled, chest tube trays in every bay. Ryan Keller appeared from behind the nurse's station, face pale. How bad is it? Lila looked through the ambulance bay doors where red lights were already smearing across the wet pavement. Bad enough that you need to stop asking. Dr. Everett Shaw came out of the surgical elevator in blue scrubs, with his white coat folded over one arm. He had been on his way to an administrative meeting. The meeting died somewhere between the elevator and the first siren. What do we know? Explosion, downtown, Lila said. Federal District, multiple casualties. First units, 2 minutes out. Shaw's face tightened, but his voice was controlled. Cancel all non-urgent cases. Open every operating room we can staff. Call in trauma, vascular, neuroplastics, burns, anesthesia. If they can hold an instrument, I want them in this building. Lila nodded to a nurse. Move. The nurse moved. The hospital began changing shape. Waiting rooms became triage zones. Hallways became holding lanes. The trauma board filled with red marks faster than Lila could write names. Security cleared routes from the ambulance entrance to radiology and surgery. Respiratory therapists dragged portable oxygen tanks into rows. A pharmacist ran with a cart so heavy the wheels rattled like loose teeth. Then the first ambulance arrived. A woman in a gray business suit came in coughing black soot into an oxygen mask. Her hair was burned on one side. Glass glittered in the skin along her cheekbone. Behind her came a man with both hands pressed against his neck while blood leaked between his fingers. Then a police cruiser pulled into the bay, and 2 officers carried a civilian between them, one leg twisted beneath him, his shoe missing his face white with shock. Then another ambulance. Then another. Then a city bus. The bus doors opened, and the wounded stepped down into the rain one by one, like survivors walking out of a nightmare. Some cried. Some stared. Some held shirts and jackets against wounds they had not yet dared to look at. A young man kept saying I was just getting coffee over and over again, as if the sentence might put the world back together if he repeated it enough. The smell arrived with them. Smoke, fuel, blood, burned fabric, wet concrete. Lila stood at the center of the floor and became the voice everyone followed. Red tags to trauma. Yellow to fast track 2. Walking wounded to the East Hall. No one sits alone. Check hearing airway bleeding burns. Ryan, stop staring at the door and put gloves on. Ryan snapped into motion. Shaw moved from bay to bay, making fast decisions, assigning surgeons, clearing bottlenecks. He was good in crisis. That much had always been true. His authority gave the room a spine, but the room was too large now. The disaster had entered faster than the system could swallow it. A child screamed near Bay 4. A man with blast lung and coughed pink foam into a mask. An elderly woman clutched a purse to her chest while a shard of metal protruded from her thigh. A nurse, slipped in blood, caught herself and kept going. Lila turned toward the doors at the exact moment Grace Monroe walked in. No white coat, no official clearance, no apology. She wore a gray jacket over scrub pants, running shoes darkened by rain, and her hospital badge still clipped to her collar. Her hair was tied back tight. Her face was calm in a way that looked almost severe under the fluorescent lights. Lila crossed to her quickly. "You cannot be here." Grace looked past her into the trauma bay. A middle-aged man on a stretcher fought for air with one side of his chest barely rising. A little girl near the far wall had soot around her mouth and swelling at her lips. Ryan stood over a central line kit with his hands hovering, not yet moving. Grace said, "That appears inaccurate. You're suspended." "I know. Shaw will remove you." Grace's eyes shifted to the gasping man. "Then he can remove me after I remove the air from that chest." Lila grabbed her arm. For 1 second the grip held. The room roared around them. Grace looked down at Lila's hand, then back at her face. Lila. There was no argument in it. No plea either. Just the name. Lila released her. Bay 2. Grace stripped off her gray jacket and tossed it onto a chair. She pulled a spare scrub top from a supply cart as it rolled past and put it on while walking. The man in Bay 2 was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, covered in dust. A jagged cut ran above his eyebrow. His lips had begun to turn blue. Grace placed her hand on his sternum. Name. His wife stood nearby, shaking. Paul. His name is Paul. Grace listened once to his chest. Needle decompression, right side, now. Ryan reached for a tray, then hesitated. "Do you want to film first?" Grace did not raise her voice. "I want him alive first." She found the landmark with 2 fingers and inserted the catheter in one clean motion. Air escaped with a violent hiss. Paul's chest rose. His wife made a sound that was almost a sob and almost a prayer. Grace looked at Ryan. "Tube tray. Finish what we started." He nodded too quickly. "Right." "Slower hands," Grace said. "Fast mind." He steadied. Grace was already moving. The little girl by the wall could not have been more than 7. Her face was streaked with tears and gray ash. Her mother knelt beside the stretcher talking too fast, touching her hair, her cheek, her hand unable to choose one place to hold. Grace crouched low enough to meet the child's eyes. "What's your name?" The girl tried to answer, but her breath caught. Her mother said Molly. "Her name is Molly." Grace watched the child's throat. "Molly, I'm Grace. Your breathing is tight, but you are still here with me." The girl blinked through tears. Grace looked at the mother. "She can hear how scared you are." The mother froze. Grace's voice stayed even. "Give her something else to hear. Tell her where she keeps her favorite shoes." The mother swallowed hard. "Your red boots," she whispered, clutching Molly's hand. "You left them by the back door because you said they were lucky. Remember the ones with the stars." Grace adjusted the oxygen mask, changed the angle of Molly's head, and watched the chest movement. "Pediatric anesthesia," she called. "Now not when they're free." Her airway is closing. Leela had already turned toward the phone. On it. Across the room, a police officer lay pale beneath a cut uniform shirt. A resident pressed a chest seal against the front of his ribs, while the officer's eyes rolled unfocused. Grace looked once from 20 feet away. Wrong side. The resident blinked. "What?" "Roll him." He hesitated. Grace walked over, put both hands on the patient's shoulder and hip, and helped turn him just enough to reveal a small wound near the back of the ribs. "Posterior entry. Seal that. Oxygen high flow." The resident corrected it. The officer sucked in a ragged breath. His eyes cleared. Grace turned away before anyone could thank her. The room began to bend around her. No announcement made it happen. No one handed her authority. It moved person to person through the practical animal sense that appears in emergencies. The people closest to death know who is seeing clearly. The people trying to keep them alive know it too. A pharmacy tech brought supplies before she finished asking. A nurse moved blood products to the bays where Grace pointed. Ryan followed her orders without looking toward the Shaw. Lila watched the room tighten into a pattern it had been missing. Then Shaw saw her. He entered from the side corridor, still gloved from another bay, and stopped so abruptly that a surgical tech nearly walked into him. Grace stood in the middle of his trauma floor, with blood on one sleeve, one hand raised toward a monitor, her voice low and exact. "Do not move him flat. He drops when flat. Sit him higher. Hang the second unit before transport. No, before." Shaw's expression changed once. Relief flashed across it, brief and involuntary. Then it vanished beneath anger. What is she doing here? No one answered. Lila kept moving. Shaw stepped toward Grace. Dr. Monroe. She did not turn immediately. She finished checking a pressure dressing on the woman with the thigh wound, then looked at him. Dr. Shaw, you are suspended from clinical duty. Grace glanced toward the ambulance doors where another stretcher was already coming in. I'll make a note. His eyes hardened. This is not optional. A paramedic shouted from the entrance. Priority 1. Male 40s. Blast trauma. Found near Federal Annex. Possible security detail. Hypotensive, unconscious. The stretcher came through the doors at speed. The man on it was muscular with close-cropped hair and burns along one side of his neck. His black compression shirt had been cut open, blood soaked the lower abdomen. A dark tactical watch remained strapped to his wrist, still ticking. No wallet, no name, no badge visible. Grace stepped in before the stretcher stopped. Pressure. 80 systolic at last check. Falling. Pulse. 150. Airway. Intubated in field. Breath sounds present but weak left side. Grace palpated the abdomen. Rigid. She looked at the small puncture wound low in front, then another mark near the flank. The path was wrong. Shrapnel or fragment deflection. Internal damage beyond the visible wound. Blood now. Type specific if available. Universal if not, or 1. Shaw moved beside her. I'll take him. Grace met his eyes for a fraction of a second. He is bleeding behind the belly. Move. The patient's pressure dropped again. No one argued. They ran him toward surgery. Lila followed as far as the double doors handing off blood products before a new call dragged her back into the flood. For the next 20 minutes, Front Range Memorial became less a hospital than a lung trying to breathe through injury. The lobby filled with soot-covered people. Security locked one corridor after reports of a possible second device. The emergency department ran out of warm blankets. 2 nurses cut sheets into temporary wraps. A respiratory therapist intubated a man in the hallway because there was no bay open. Ryan placed his first emergency chest tube with Grace's voice still in his head, though she was no longer beside him. Slow hands, fast mind. Lila moved from patient to patient, but her attention kept snapping back toward OR1. Something about the federal patient had disturbed Grace. Lila had seen it in the brief tightening around her eyes. Not fear. Recognition of a pattern. When she finally reached the surgical corridor with another cooler of blood, the door to OR1 was partially open. The sound inside was wrong. Not loud. Worse. Contained. The anesthesiologist stood rigid at the head of the table. Pressure is falling again. Shaw was deep in the abdomen, suction hissing blood-soaking lap pads too quickly. More suction. The scrub nurse handed it over. Shaw packed higher, adjusted, searched. His movements were still skilled, but the field was not yielding to him. The damage was complex, the wound path deceptive. Blood appeared from one place, vanished under pressure, then returned somewhere else. It was a map that changed while he read it. Another unit, he said. The anesthesiologist answered, already running. Lila stood just inside the door with the cooler. She felt the room waiting. Everyone was waiting for Shaw's authority to become certainty. It did not. Then Grace appeared behind her. She had blood on both sleeves now. A thin line of sweat ran from her temple beneath the edge of her cap. She took in the field through the open door and spoke before anyone announced her. Stop digging high. Every head turned. Shaw looked up. No. Grace was already gloving. He is bleeding lower and posterior. You are not assigned to this room. I'm assigned to the patient. Get out. Grace stepped to the table. Left lower quadrant. Behind the pack. 3 centimeters deeper. Do not touch the aorta. The monitor alarm sharpened. The anesthesiologist said doctor. It was unclear which doctor she meant. Shaw stared at Grace. Anger and something else fought in his eyes. The something else looked like the first honest knowledge that the man on the table might die because he refused to move aside. Grace's voice lowered. Trust me, or watch him die. The words did not strike like a challenge. They landed like a measurement. Shaw took one small step back. In that room, it sounded louder than a shouted order. Grace moved into position. Retractor. Lila was there before anyone else placing it in her hand. Grace cleared the field. Not that angle. Lower, hold. Shaw moved opposite her, hands ready, face pale above the mask. Hold exactly there, Grace said. He obeyed. She suctioned once, then packed away a fold of bowel, then followed the pressure of blood to a space Shaw had not opened far enough. There. The bleed appeared dark and urgent. She clamped it. The monitor began to change. Not safe, but less doomed. Grace did not pause. More light. Pack the bowel. I want the second source before it finds us. The room adjusted around her. There was no drama in the next 12 minutes. That was what made it astonishing. Grace did not perform mastery. She simply worked. Clamp, tie, reassess, suction, pressure, release. Look again. Her hands were quick when speed mattered and still when stillness mattered more. Every movement seemed to remove noise from the room. Shaw assisted where she told him. Twice she corrected his hand position by less than an inch. Not there. There. He moved. Hold it. He held. The suction canisters stopped filling at the same terrifying pace. The anesthesiologist called out numbers that slowly became less catastrophic. Pressure coming up. 76, 82, holding. Grace kept working. Do not trust the first good number. Lila stood at the instrument table anticipating without being asked. She had seen surgeons demand loyalty, respect, obedience. Grace required attention. That was harder and cleaner. At last, the field quieted. Grace checked the repair, searched for another source, found a smaller vessel, tied it, and stepped back half a pace. He goes to ICU open enough to breathe, not closed enough to satisfy anyone's schedule. Watch lactate. Watch pressure. If he drops, we look again. She stripped off her outer gloves. No one spoke. The patient lived beneath the lights, surrounded by people who had just watched death change direction. Then the OR doors opened. 3 men entered in dark suits. The first 2 moved like security. The third did not need to. His authority entered before him. Middle-aged, controlled rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat. He held up a badge. Central Intelligence Agency. The room froze. The lead agent's eyes found Grace immediately. Dr. Grace Monroe. Grace looked at him. Yes, I'm Agent Thomas Rourke. You need to come with us immediately. Shaw straightened. She is in the middle of a mass casualty response. Rourke did not look away from Grace. National security emergency. Shaw's anger returned, because anger was easier than confusion. You cannot walk into my operating room and remove one of my surgeons. Rourke finally turned his head. Dr. Shaw, she was requested under federal authority. She is suspended from clinical duties. Rourke's expression did not change. Not from ours. The scrub nurse looked from the badge to Grace, then whispered CIA. Rourke stepped closer. Transport is waiting. Grace looked once at the patient on the table, then at Lila. The glance carried everything it needed to carry. Pressure trends. Lactate every 2 hours. Watch the abdomen. If his hands get cold before the numbers fall, trust the hands. Lila nodded. I've got him. Grace removed her gloves and dropped them into the bin. Blood marked the cuff of her scrub top. A strand of hair had come loose near her cheek. She looked less like a legend than a woman who had been working too long under bad lights and had no time to be tired. Shaw stepped into her path. Grace. It was the first time he had said her first name without using it as a weapon. She stopped. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The agents waited. Grace gave him 1 second, then another. When he still had no words, she walked past him. The agents closed around her, not like guards exactly, but like men who understood how to move someone important through danger without making a spectacle of it. Leela followed them into the corridor. Outside the OR, the hospital was still in full crisis. Stretchers moved. Pages sounded overhead. A custodian stood pressed against a wall with a mop in his hands, staring as Grace passed between CIA agents with blood drying on her sleeves. Nurses looked up. Residents stopped mid-sentence. No one understood the whole of it. Everyone understood enough. At the side exit, security had already opened a route normally reserved for transplant teams and executive transfers. Rain slanted through the covered drive in silver lines. A black SUV waited with its rear door open and engine running. Grace stopped under the awning. For a moment, she looked back through the glass doors toward the hospital. Not at Shaw, not at the agents, at the work still happening inside. Leela stood beside her, rain misting her face. "Are you all right?" Grace did not answer immediately. From inside came another overhead page distorted by distance. Then Grace said no. Leela looked at her. Grace's face remained calm. "But that is not required." Lila swallowed. "You knew they might come for you one day." Grace looked toward the SUV. "I knew quiet never lasts as long as you hope." "Agent Rourke," said Doctor. Grace stepped into the rain, then into the vehicle. The door closed. The SUV pulled away without sirens. Lila stood under the awning until the taillights disappeared into traffic. Shaw came up beside her a moment later. He looked older than he had an hour ago. For a while he said nothing. Rain tapped against the metal roof above them. Finally he asked, "Who is she?" Leela kept her eyes on the wet street. "That is what you should have asked before you decided she was ordinary." Inside the SUV, Grace sat between two agents, while Denver blurred past the windows. No one offered comfort. No one gave a full explanation. That told her more than reassurance would have. Rourke sat across from her phone in hand, reading updates that did not reach his face. Grace looked at the city lights sliding over the rain-streaked glass. "How bad?" Rourke glanced up. "Bad. Who is the patient?" "Need to know." Grace turned her head slowly. "If I am cutting, I need to know whether it is brain spine, lung, or vessel." Rourke held her gaze for a moment. Thoracic spine. Fragment migration. Declining motor response. Grace looked back out the window. The world narrowed in useful ways. Thoracic spine meant cord risk. Edema. Vascular proximity. A margin measured in millimeters. Time mattered not as an idea, but as swelling pressure tissue nerve signal fading into silence. When was the last neurocheck? 40 minutes ago. Grace closed her eyes once. When she opened them, the quiet doctor from Front Range was gone from her face. Something older had taken its place. Then drive like those 40 minutes were stolen. The SUV moved through Denver without sirens. That disturbed Grace more than noise would have. Sirens meant public urgency. Sirens meant the city was allowed to know something was wrong. This silence meant the emergency belonged to rooms without windows, to phone calls that were not recorded in ordinary logs, to patients who arrived without names and left without evidence they had ever been there. Rain threaded down the glass in crooked silver lines. Streetlights dragged across the windows and broke apart over Grace's reflection. She sat with her hands resting flat on her thighs, still in blood-marked scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and smoke from the hospital. Agent Thomas Rourke sat across from her, his phone in one hand, his other hand resting near the inside of his jacket. The two agents beside Grace faced forward. Neither spoke. Their silence was not awkward. It was trained. Grace had known that kind of silence before. It belonged to people who had already chosen what they would do if the vehicle stopped wrong. She looked past Rourke to the dark windshield. "Where are we going?" "Hawthorne Federal Medical Annex." "Never heard of it." "You were not supposed to." Grace absorbed that. "How long since injury?" Rourke checked his phone. "Initial wound was sustained almost 6 hours ago. Stabilized in transit. Deterioration started 40 minutes before we reached out." "Reached out," Grace repeated. His eyes lifted. "That is the phrase we are using." She looked at him for a moment. "You pulled me out of a mass casualty event after opening my sealed file." Rourke did not deny it. "Yes." "Then use better words." Something that might have been respect moved through his face and disappeared. "We activated you." Grace turned back to the window. There it was. Activated. Not called, not requested, not consulted. Activated. The word sat in her chest with old weight. For years, she had tried to become ordinary enough that no one would use language like that around her again. She had rented a small apartment, worked civilian shifts, checked supply carts, spoken only when medicine required it. She had accepted the strange loneliness of people misreading silence because it still seemed better than being recognized for the worst rooms she had survived. Now the road had narrowed anyway. "What is his name?" she asked. Rourke looked down at his phone. Agent Ethan Ward. The name meant nothing to her face, but her mind held it. Age: 41. Baseline health: excellent. Neurologic status before sedation: initially intact. Left leg weakness during transfer, declining response before arrival. Grace breathed in slowly. Fragment. Bullet fragment. Ricocheted through soft tissue. Lodged adjacent to the thoracic spine after internal deflection. Vascular involvement. Possible. Imaging pending full review. Grace looked at him sharply. Pending. We have scans. Scans are not review. Rourke's jaw tightened. We have a neurosurgeon on site. Then why am I in this car? The answer came after a pause. Because he said he could not guarantee movement if he attempted removal. Grace gave a small humorless exhale. No one can guarantee movement. He also said he had never seen this exact injury pattern. Grace looked back out at the rain. That, at least, was honest. The city began to thin around them. Office towers gave way to industrial blocks, then dark stretches of access roads and government fencing. The vehicle turned twice through streets that seemed built to be forgotten. A concrete barrier rose ahead, followed by a gate with no sign and no visible name. Armed guards stepped from a booth before the SUV stopped. Rourke lowered the window. No one asked who Grace was. A guard looked into the vehicle, saw her face, and nodded to someone behind the glass. The first gate opened, then another. The SUV descended a ramp into a covered entrance where concrete swallowed the rain. Hawthorne Federal Medical Annex looked less like a hospital than a secret pretending to have plumbing. The garage was lit by white overhead panels. Security cameras tracked every movement. A medical transport team waited near an elevator with a sealed equipment cart. Two armed officers stood against the wall in a posture Grace had seen in bases and embassy compounds and places that had no reason to appear on maps. Grace stepped out. Cold air hit her wet sleeves. A woman in a dark suit approached with a tablet. Dr. Monroe. Grace said, "Who has the most recent imaging?" The woman blinked once, then recovered. "Conference room 3. Take me there." Rourke almost smiled. No one searched her. No one checked her badge. No one asked her to sign in. That told Grace the real file had been opened. The elevator ride down was silent. 20 seconds, maybe 30. Enough time for memory to find a crack. A different elevator came back to her. Not clean like this one. A shaking metal lift inside a reinforced aid station outside Mosul. Power flickering. A surgical resident across from her with blood on his boots and vomit on his sleeve. He had been 28 and terrified that fear made him useless. Grace had told him, "Keep your hands busy." Fear hates competition. The doors opened. She was back in Colorado. The secure medical floor was bright, spotless, and too quiet. Monitors glowed behind glass. Surgical carts stood ready in perfect rows. Staff moved quickly, but no one ran. That told her they were either well-trained or deeply frightened of being seen as frightened. Maybe both. Rourke led her into a sealed briefing room. The scans were already up. Grace stopped in the doorway. The room could have been empty for all she cared. The image had taken everything. Thoracic-level injury. Fragment lodged dangerously close to the cord. Angled track. Soft tissue swelling. Vascular proximity unclear but ugly. The kind of injury that punished confidence and hesitation equally. She walked to the screen. Most recent slice. A man in Navy surgical scrubs stood beside the display. Military posture, civilian haircut. He tapped the tablet and brought up thinner images. Grace leaned in. Magnify. He did. She folded her arms without realizing it, fingers pressing lightly into the inside of her elbows. Old habit, thinking posture. Something to keep the body from moving while the mind entered the wound. The fragment sat near T7. Not where a clean path would have placed it. It had traveled after impact changed course and settled with the quiet cruelty of metal near nerve. Edema had already begun to narrow the margin. A wrong pull could paralyze him. A wrong weight could do the same. Behind her, someone entered the room. Grace knew the footsteps before the voice. Dr. Monroe. She turned. Colonel Diane Merrick stood near the conference table in a dark service uniform, ribbons neat across her chest, silver hair cut at her jaw. She looked older than when Grace had last seen her, but not softer. Some people were not built to soften. They only became more precise. Grace straightened. Colonel Merrick. Merrick raised her hand in a crisp salute. Grace returned it without hesitation. The room noticed. Rourke noticed. The surgeon in Navy scrubs noticed. Colonel Merrick lowered her hand. I wish this were a social call. Grace looked back at the scan. You never made those. A faint shadow of warmth crossed Merrick's face, then vanished. Agent Ward was injured during a compromised extraction tied to the Denver blast. His team intercepted material connected to a planned second phase. We believe he may be the only living person who knows where that material was moved. Grace did not turn. Is he conscious? No. Then his intelligence value is not my first problem. No, Merrick said. His spinal cord is. Grace stepped closer to the screen. Last motor check. Rourke answered 47 minutes ago. Declining left side. Withdrawal present but weak before sedation. Neuro monitoring. Ready, said the surgeon in Navy scrubs. Blood. As much as you need. Imaging in the room. Yes. Who is your spine surgeon? The man in Navy scrubs lifted his chin slightly. Dr. Malcolm Tate. Grace looked at him for the first time. His eyes were steady, but the skin beneath them was tight with exhaustion. You declined removal. Tate accepted the blow without flinching. I declined to pretend I had experience with this injury path. That answer mattered. Grace nodded once. Good. The door opened again. Lila. Bennett entered first, escorted by an agent. She still wore hospital scrubs. Her hair had been pulled tighter than before, and there was a streak of dried blood near her wrist. She saw Grace and stopped for half a breath. Relief moved through her face before professionalism covered it. Grace, you came. You asked. Grace had not exactly asked. She had given Rourke a name on the drive, but Lila understood the difference between invitation and need. Behind her came Everett Shaw. He wore freshly issued surgical greens with no name embroidered over the pocket. Without the white coat, without his office, without the hospital walls bending around his title, he looked almost unfamiliar. Older, less certain. A man stripped down to hands training and the consequences of what he had chosen. His eyes moved across the room. Armed guards outside the glass. Federal staff. Colonel Merrick. The scans. The way everyone waited for Grace, not him. He looked at her. Dr. Monroe. Everett. The use of his first name unsettled him. It removed the shield of formality without offering closeness. He stepped toward the scan. What is this? Grace did not answer immediately. She let him read it. His surgeon's eyes found the danger fast. The line between arrogance and skill was not always wide. Shaw had skill. That was part of what made his failure worse. He inhaled slowly. This is nearly impossible. Grace said no. It is unforgiving. Colonel Merrick looked at Shaw and Lila. Before we begin, you need to understand who is leading this room. Grace's shoulders tightened. Colonel. Merrick ignored the warning. Dr. Grace Monroe served as lead trauma surgeon for Joint Special Operations medical teams in Afghanistan, Iraq, and northern Syria. She operated in field environments under active bombardment blackout conditions, evacuation delays, and mass casualty overload. Her record was sealed because many of the units she supported and many of the patients she treated remained classified. The room went still. Lila's eyes shifted toward Grace, not with shock exactly, but with the painful confirmation of something she had already felt. Shaw stared at Colonel Merrick, then at Grace. "You were special operations." Grace kept her eyes on the scan. "Among other things." His voice lowered. "Why didn't you say anything?" Grace looked at him then. The room seemed to sharpen around her answer. "You never asked a question that wanted the truth." No one spoke. Shaw looked away first. Rourke stepped into the silence. "Dr. Monroe, can you remove it?" Grace studied the fragment again. The honest answer was complicated. Medicine hated yes and no when tissue was swollen and blood had its own ideas. But rooms like this did not need comfort. They needed direction. Yes. Rourke's face did not change, but the air around him did. "What do you need?" Grace pointed to the image. Magnification at 8. Neuro monitoring active before positioning and throughout. Intraoperative imaging ready not down the hall. Blood in the room. 2 suction lines. Fine vascular instruments opened. Microforceps. Long, angled clamps. "I want Dr. Tate available but not primary." Tate nodded. "Understood." Grace turned. "Lila Bennett scrubs with me." Lila said good. "And Dr. Shaw." Shaw looked up. Rourke glanced at Grace. "The same Dr. Shaw who suspended you." "Yes." Shaw's face tightened. Grace met his eyes. "I need steady exposure for a long time." "You have good hands when your ego is not using them." The sentence struck him cleanly. He did not defend himself. "What do you need me to do?" Grace looked back at the scan. "Hold exactly where I tell you. If I say lower, you move lower. If I say stop, you stop. If your pride has an opinion, it can wait outside." Shaw nodded once. "It will." Grace watched him for a second longer, judging whether he believed himself. Then she turned to Lila. "Anticipate me." Lila's answer came without hesitation. "Always." They moved to prep. The locker room was small, clean, and too bright. A folded set of surgical greens waited for Grace on a bench, correct size, no name stitched anywhere. Beside it sat a sealed package containing a cap, mask, shoe covers, and sterile undergloves. Grace touched the folded fabric with 2 fingers. They had my size. Lila stood at the sink, washing dried blood from her wrist. "That bothers you more than the CIA car. It is more personal." Lila looked at her in the mirror. "You were really going to work at Front Range and let everyone think you were just quiet." Grace changed her top. "That was the plan." "That was a bad plan." Grace tied the scrub top behind her neck. "It was a hopeful one." Lila turned from the sink. The words landed gently, and because they were gentle, they hurt more. "You wanted to disappear." Grace opened the cap package. "No, I wanted to arrive without bringing every room I had ever survived with me." Lila said nothing. There was nothing clean enough to say. At the scrub sinks, Shaw joined them. For a few moments only, water spoke. Clear streams ran over hands and wrists, down into stainless drains. Grace scrubbed with the exact rhythm of ritual. Not rushed, not slow. Every motion remembered by muscle, older than thought. Shaw stood 1 station over. "I read your file wrong," he said quietly. Grace did not look at him. "You could not read my file." "I read the gaps as weakness." "Yes." He swallowed. "And the silence as arrogance." Grace rinsed her hands. "You are not the first." That did not comfort him. He said, "I do not expect you to forgive me." Good. The word was not cruel. It was efficient. It cleared false expectations from the room. Lila shut off her water. Grace lifted her hands and let the excess drip. "Inside that room, he is the patient. Not your apology, not my history, not your guilt. If you bring anything in, make sure it helps him." Shaw nodded. "I understand." Grace looked at him. "Understanding is not the same as doing." Then the OR doors opened. Agent Ethan Ward lay prone beneath the lights, draped but not yet opened. His face was turned slightly to one side, pale against the padding. Tubes entered him. Lines ran from him. Monitors translated him into numbers glowing on screens. The secure operating room was beautiful in the way expensive places can be beautiful while holding terror. Every tray was perfect. Every machine ready. Every cable tied out of the way. No dust, no flickering generator, no rain leaking through canvas, no distant artillery. Still, Grace smelled the same thing beneath it all. Antiseptic, plastic, warm equipment, human risk. She stepped to the table. Baseline. The neuromonitoring technician answered. Signals present. Left lower extremity reduced but detectable. Anesthesiology added pressure stable on support. Oxygenation good. Grace nodded. Do not chase perfect numbers. Tell me when they change. Understood. Leela stood at her right. Shaw took position across from her. Dr. Tate remained near the back, available, watching without resentment. Grace appreciated that. Pride had killed more patients than ignorance ever had. Scalpel. Lila placed it in Grace's hand. The first incision was exact. The room narrowed. Skin opened, layers separated, blood appeared in small, controlled amounts. Grace moved with deliberate patience. This was not the trauma bay, not a belly full of blood where speed could rescue the dying. This was a narrow approach near the cord where haste could become its own weapon. Shaw retracted. Grace glanced once. Lower. He adjusted. Less. He moved again. Hold. He held. For the first hour, the operation belonged to discipline. No one wasted language. Suction whispered. Instruments clicked. The monitors kept their measured speech. Lila passed what Grace needed before the request had fully formed. A fine clamp, a sponge, irrigation, microsuction. Shaw's shoulders began stiff, then settled into work. He did exactly what she told him. That mattered more than remorse. Grace opened layer by layer, approaching the fragment's path without trusting the obvious route. The injury had lied on the scan, and tissue would lie worse under light. Swelling distorted planes. Blood blurred landmarks. The fragment's path was not direct. It had ricocheted, redirected, and lodged with cruel precision near the structures that could not forgive error. Image. The screen updated. Grace studied it. Angles confirmed. We do not chase from the visible track. Tate spoke from the back. You are coming medial. Not yet. He nodded. Shaw's wrist shifted slightly as he adjusted his stance. Grace did not look at him. Commit Everett. He froze, then steadied the retractor. Like that. Better. The word entered him harder than praise. It came attached to use. 90 minutes in a small vessel began to ooze from a place that had looked clean 30 seconds earlier. A younger nurse on the far side moved too quickly toward an instrument tray. Grace said, "Breathe first." The nurse stopped. Then suction. The nurse handed it. Grace controlled the bleed without lifting her voice. No one mentioned it again. That was how good rooms survived. Not by avoiding fear, but by refusing to let fear become the loudest person present. 2 hours, and Leela felt the ache begin in her lower back. She ignored it. Shaw's forearms had started to burn. He ignored that too. Grace seemed not to have a body at all except for her hands and eyes. But Lila saw the cost in the fine line of sweat beneath Grace's cap. She also saw something else. Grace was not cold. That was what people misunderstood. Her calm was not absence. It was containment. Everything human in her had been folded tightly enough not to spill into the wound. Neurostatus, Grace said. Signals stable. Left side unchanged. Good. She did not sound relieved. Relief came after danger had no more doors to open. They reached the deeper field just after the 3rd hour. The room grew quieter without being told. Even the machines seemed to soften. Under magnification, the fragment became visible as a dark, small shape lodged near pale tissue that carried a man's future inside it. It looked absurdly insignificant for something with the power to take away walking, running, standing, kneeling, dancing, pacing a room in anger, stepping towards someone you love. Metal did not care what it stole. Grace's breathing slowed. Leela watched her eyes. There was recognition there. Not fear, memory. Grace extended her hand. Microforceps. Lila placed them into her palm. Grace did not move at once. She let the room settle into the still point she needed. And then memory came anyway. Kandahar. A generator failing halfway through spinal exposure. The lights dying in a wave. A flashlight held between a medic's teeth. Dust moving across the wound field because the blast doors had not sealed correctly. A 19-year-old soldier awake before surgery, lips cracked, asking if he would run again. Grace had not lied to him. She had said, "I am going to try." Trying had cost 4 hours, 2 units of blood they almost did not have, and a piece of herself she never found again. The memory passed through her. She did not fight it. She let it leave. Signals she asked. Stable. Grace moved. The forceps entered the narrow space with a precision that made the entire room seem to stop breathing. She did not tug. She did not test twice. She knew the angle because the last 3 hours had been built for this one motion. The tips closed. The tissue resisted. Grace waited half a beat adjusted by less than the width of a thread and lifted. The fragment came free. No one trusted it at first. The metal rested in the forceps' blood dark and small. The monitor held. The neurotechnician leaned toward her screen, signals stable. Still, no one moved. Grace placed the fragment into a small metal tray. The sound it made was tiny. It filled the room. Image, Grace said. The updated view confirmed removal. No migration, no immediate compression, no catastrophic bleed. Shaw lowered his eyes for a second, then lifted them again. Something in his face had changed. Not awe. Awe was too easy. This was recognition with nowhere to hide from itself. Grace said close. The spell broke. The room returned to work. Closure took time. Careful layers. Irrigation. Hemostasis. Counts. Dressings. The body slowly transformed from battlefield back into patient. The monitors remained steady. The left side signal stayed reduced, but present. Present mattered. Present was a door left open. When the last dressing was secured, Grace stepped back. Keep him warm. Imaging before sunrise. Neuro-exam as soon as sedation allows. Watch for swelling delayed bleed infection. Do not let the clean closure make anyone stupid. The anesthesiologist said pressure stable. The neurotechnician added signals preserved. No one cheered. Good operating rooms did not cheer. They absorbed survival quietly, because everyone in them knew survival could still change its mind. Grace removed her gloves. The outer pair hit the bin with a soft, wet sound. For the first time, fatigue reached her face. Lila saw it and moved before Grace asked. She brought a cup of water from the side counter. Grace took it. Thanks. Lila watched her drink. You never told me any of that. Grace swallowed. There was never a good moment. That is not true. Grace handed back the cup. It is true enough. Across the room, Shaw stood near the instrument table, still gloved, looking down at his hands. He had spent decades believing skill had a shape, a root, a language. He believed it moved from elite training to controlled practice to recognized authority. He had not been entirely wrong. That was the trouble. Partial truths made excellent cages. Grace Monroe had walked into his hospital carrying a kind of experience he had no category for, and because he had no category, he treated her as a threat. Now, the proof of his failure sat in a metal tray, a fragment smaller than a fingernail. A man alive because she had known how to remove it. He approached her slowly. You did in 4 hours what most surgeons would not attempt with a full committee and a week to plan. Grace leaned against the counter for the briefest moment. It was not 4 hours. Shaw waited. It was 15 years. The room held that answer. Beyond the glass, Rourke stood with Colonel Merrick in the observation area. Neither of them smiled. Grace understood. A saved life did not erase the emergency around it. Ethan Ward still had to wake. The intelligence he carried still had to matter. Denver still had smoke in its streets. Front Range still had patients on gurneys and blood on the floor. The work never ended cleanly. Rourke opened the OR door after the patient had been transferred to recovery under guard. "Briefing room," he said. Grace looked at him. "My patient needs handoff. It is complete. I decide when my handoff is complete." Rourke accepted the correction. Grace gave final instructions to the ICU physician, who listened with the pale attention of someone aware he was being handed both a patient and a national problem. Only then did she follow Rourke. The briefing room this time was smaller. No wall-sized anatomy display, just a steel table, a coffee carafe no one touched, and a classified file resting in front of Rourke. Colonel Merrick stood near the far wall. Lila sat beside Grace. Shaw sat across from her, not at the head of the table. No one had assigned seats. He had chosen that one. Rourke opened the file. Inside were photographs, reports, commendations, medical logs, and pages thick with black redaction bars. He turned the first photograph toward Shaw. A younger Grace looked back from an identification image. Shorter hair, sharper face. Same eyes. Another photo showed her in surgical greens beside a plywood operating table under harsh temporary lighting. Another showed her in body armor kneeling beside a medic with blood across her sleeve. In one image, dust streaked her face so heavily that only her eyes seemed clean. Shaw stared. Colonel Merrick spoke voice-controlled. Dr. Monroe's listed deployments include Afghanistan, Iraq, and northern Syria. 57 combat trauma procedures during attached operational periods. No intraoperative losses in the reviewed record. Silver Star, Purple Heart, Presidential Unit citation through Medical Command support. Lila looked down at the table, blinking once. Grace did not look at the file. She had spent years not looking at it. Rourke turned another page. Some details remain sealed. Enough can be stated plainly. Dr. Monroe became one of the few surgeons in the country with repeated experience in complex trauma near the thoracic spine under degraded conditions. Shaw's voice came rough. Degraded conditions. Grace looked at him. No power. Bad blood supply. Dirt in the field. Incoming fire. Evacuation delayed. People screaming in 3 languages. That kind of degraded. He lowered his eyes. Rourke continued. The unidentified gunshot patient you operated on at Front Range was Caleb Brooks, CIA deep cover asset. He was Agent Ward's partner. Grace's face changed for the first time since entering the room. Not dramatically. Just enough. The man from the alley. Rourke nodded. You saved him without knowing who he was. Grace looked at the file. Is he alive? Yes. Awake? Not yet. She absorbed that. Lila said quietly, You saved both of them. Colonel Merrick answered before Grace could. She saved the person in front of her. That is why she was trusted with both. The sentence settled over the room. Grace's hands rested on the table. There was a faint red mark around one wrist where her gloves had pressed too long. Shaw looked at the photographs again, then at her. I treated absence of evidence like evidence of absence. Grace did not soften the truth for him. Yes, I mocked your credentials. You mocked what you could not read. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the authority he had worn for years seemed to have no place to attach. I thought I was protecting the hospital. Grace's voice was quiet. You were protecting your idea of yourself inside it. No one interrupted. The ventilation hummed overhead. Somewhere beyond the sealed walls, a phone rang once and was answered quickly. Shaw folded his hands on the table. I am sorry. Grace sat very still. Not because the apology meant nothing. Because it had arrived after the damage and late apologies always entered a room carrying the people they did not save in time. She said, I know. He looked at her, waiting for more. She did not give it. Rourke closed part of the file. Dr. Monroe. Agent Ward's successful stabilization prevents a strategic failure I cannot fully discuss in this room. There will be formal recognition through appropriate channels. Grace almost smiled. It vanished before becoming one. I would rather he moves his legs. Rourke nodded. So would we. Colonel Merrick stepped closer to the table. You should rest. Grace looked at the coffee carafe. I have heard that before. Did you listen? Rarely. For the first time that night, Merrick's expression softened enough to show the old bond beneath the rank. You are still impossible. Grace stood. No, just tired. Lila rose with her. Outside the briefing room, the corridor seemed too clean for the lives it had just held. Agents moved in quiet patterns. Medical staff spoke in low voices. Behind guarded glass, Ethan Ward was being transferred to recovery with enough tubes and monitors attached to make him look less like a field officer than a fragile argument against death. Grace stopped at the window. Ward lay still, sedated, pale. She watched his covered feet beneath the blanket. Leila came to stand beside her. You're waiting to see if they move. Not yet. You told Rourke he needed imaging before sunrise. I did. And you are going to stand here until then. Grace did not answer. Leila leaned her shoulder lightly against the wall. Grace, that made her look over. Lila's voice softened. You do not have to hold the whole building with your spine. Grace looked back through the glass. I know. You say that like someone who does not believe it. Grace breathed in. For a second, the exhaustion behind her eyes became visible. The kind that had lived too long to be fixed by sleep. I was trying to be a normal doctor, she said. Lila did not move. Grace kept her eyes on Ward. I was tired of being useful only when everything was burning. Tired of introductions that arrived before I did. Tired of people hearing war in my name before they heard medicine. Her voice did not break. It did not need to. At Front Range, I thought I could walk in, do the work, go home, and let that be enough. Lila looked through the glass with her. It should have been. Grace said nothing. Behind them, Shaw had stopped several feet away. He had heard enough to understand that the apology he had given was only the beginning of his debt, not the payment of it. Grace turned from the window. Rourke approached with a secure phone in hand. Transport is ready to take you back to Front Range if you want it. Grace looked down at her scrubs. Dried blood at the cuff. Smoke in the fabric. Weariness in her bones. Front Range still has casualties. Yes? Lila's brows lifted. You are not going back into that floor. Grace looked at her. Are they still receiving patients? Rourke answered reduced flow, but yes. Lila crossed her arms. You just finished a 4-hour spinal procedure after a mass casualty response. Grace said. The patients do not know that. Shaw stepped forward. I will go back. Grace looked at him. He seemed to understand the offer was not enough, so he continued. I will go back. I will cover the floor. I will tell the board you were pulled under federal authority. I will withdraw the suspension. Grace's expression did not change. You do not withdraw harm by naming it paperwork. He took that without protest. No, but I can start with the paperwork. Rourke watched the exchange silent. Grace looked once more through the glass at Ethan Ward. The left foot under the blanket did not move. Not yet. She turned away. Take us back. Lila stared at her. Us. Grace looked at Shaw. He has work to do. Shaw nodded. Yes, he said, I do. As they walked toward the elevator, Colonel Merrick called after her. Grace. She stopped. Merrick's voice carried less command now. You did good work tonight. Grace looked back. For a moment, the clean corridor fell away, and they were two women standing again in some other country, outside a surgical tent with dawn coming up over smoke and dust. Grace said, He is not awake yet. No, Merrick said. But he has a chance. Grace accepted that because it was the only honest form of hope medicine allowed. The elevator doors opened. Grace stepped inside with Lila Shaw and Rourke. As the doors closed, Shaw looked at his own reflection in the brushed metal. He looked like a man seeing himself without the frame he had spent years building. Grace stood beside him silent, not triumphant, not forgiving, just present. The elevator began to rise. The elevator rose in silence. No one looked at anyone else for the first few floors. Grace stood with her hands folded in front of her, still wearing scrubs that carried 3 different kinds of blood. Lila leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, but alert in the way trauma nurses learned to be alert even when their bodies had begun begging for sleep. Agent Rourke watched the numbers climb above the doors. Everett Shaw stared at his reflection in the brushed metal and seemed unable to decide whether the man looking back at him was someone he recognized. When the doors opened at the underground garage, the same black SUV waited with the engine running. Denver was still wet when they emerged above ground. Rain had softened into mist, but the city looked bruised. Police lights pulsed against buildings. News helicopters swept low over downtown. Smoke still rose from the federal district in a dark smear that the morning wind could not quite tear apart. No one spoke during the ride back to Front Range Memorial. Grace watched the city through the window. Her face remained still, but her eyes did not. They moved over barricades. Ambulances, officers standing beneath streetlights. Civilians wrapped in blankets. Strangers holding phones to their ears with expressions that meant the person on the other end had not answered. The hospital came into view just before dawn. Its glass front reflected red emergency lights and gray sky. The ambulance bay was still active, though no longer overwhelmed. A line of stretchers waited near triage. Nurses moved slower now, not because the danger had passed, but because the first wave of adrenaline had burned through them and left only discipline behind. When the SUV stopped, Grace opened the door before Rourke could. Lila followed. Shaw stepped out last. The three of them entered through the side corridor near surgical receiving. Inside, the hospital smelled of antiseptic smoke, damp uniforms, and old coffee. It sounded exhausted. Monitors still chimed. Phones still rang. Somewhere, a child cried in broken bursts until a nurse murmured something too soft to hear. Lila went straight to the board. Grace looked across the trauma floor. She saw the story of the last hours written in small details. Bloody footprints fading where someone had tried to mop too quickly. Empty wrappers from chest tube kits. A stack of used blankets near the linen bin. Ryan Keller sitting beside a patient with his elbows on his knees, his face gray with fatigue, one gloved hand still resting on the bed rail because the patient had asked him not to leave. Ryan looked up and saw Grace. For a moment he only stared. Then he stood. Dr. Monroe. Grace crossed to him. How many active reds? 2 in surgery, 1 waiting for vascular. 4 step-downs pending beds. Burns took 6. Pediatrics has Molly. Grace's face shifted slightly. The girl with the airway. She's intubated stable. Her mother is still talking about the red boots. Leela closed her eyes briefly. Grace nodded. Good. Ryan swallowed. I placed the chest tube on the officer. I heard. He lived. Grace looked at him. Then, remember what your hands did right. The words hit him harder than praise. Shaw had stopped near the entrance. People noticed him, then noticed Grace beside him. The room altered around the sight of them together. Not dramatically. Hospitals rarely gave drama room to stand for long. But conversations thinned, eyes lifted. A nurse at the desk froze with a chart in her hand. Shaw took a breath. His voice carried across the trauma floor. Dr. Monroe is cleared for clinical duty. No one moved. He continued, each word costing him more than the last. Her suspension was inappropriate. I will address that formally with the board. Lila looked up from the trauma board. Grace did not look at him. She was already pulling on gloves. Where is the vascular case? Ryan pointed. 4-4. Grace moved. Shaw watched her go. Rourke remained at the side entrance for a moment, coat dark with mist. He looked at the hospital floor, at the wounded, at the nurses moving beyond exhaustion, at the surgeon he had brought back into a room that had not known how to keep her. Then he turned and left without another word. By noon, the first news crews had gathered outside the hospital entrance. They knew pieces. That was how stories reached the public in fragments sharp enough to cut, but not large enough to explain. A decorated trauma surgeon with a sealed record. A suspension. A federal emergency. CIA vehicles. A chief surgeon under internal review. The hospital released a statement that said, almost nothing with impressive care. Front Range Memorial was cooperating with federal authorities. Patient privacy remained protected. The trauma team had responded with courage. The institution would review all relevant protocols. Downstairs, Lila read the statement on a break room television with the sound off. She snorted. Grace sat across from her eating crackers from a packet someone had found in the supply closet. Leela said, "They use the word courage 3 times. Grace chewed. Efficient. Saves them from using names. You are not even a little curious what they are saying about you. No, that is unnatural." Grace opened a second packet. "It is peaceful." Lila shook her head, but there was affection in it now, open and unguarded. "You know they are going to want you upstairs." Grace looked toward the hallway. "They can want from there." The call came 15 minutes later. "Board conference room. Immediate attendance requested." Grace finished the cracker, wiped her hands, and stood. Lila stood too. Grace looked at her. "You were not requested." Leela picked up her coffee. "That has never stopped me." The boardroom sat on the administrative floor, where the carpet was quiet and the air smelled faintly of furniture polish instead of blood. Men and women in tailored jackets sat around a long table. Legal counsel was present. The hospital president looked as if she had not slept and had spent the morning learning that a crisis could reach higher than press management. Shaw stood near the window. He turned when Grace entered. For once, he did not take the head of the table. The hospital president began carefully. "Dr. Monroe, first on behalf of Front Range Memorial, I want to acknowledge your extraordinary service during the emergency response." Grace remained standing. The patients needed care, yes, of course. Still, the circumstances surrounding your suspension require review. Grace said nothing. Legal counsel folded her hands. "Dr. Shaw has already submitted a written statement indicating that he acted without sufficient consideration of restricted Federal Service documentation." Grace looked at Shaw. His face was tired, but he did not look away. A board member cleared his throat. "Dr. Shaw, for the record, did you suspend Dr. Monroe after she intervened in the Price case?" Shaw answered yes, and the patient survived because of that intervention. Shaw's jaw shifted. "Yes." Another board member asked, "Were you aware her file contained federal restrictions?" "Yes." "Did you seek proper clarification before taking administrative action?" "No." The room held the answer. The hospital president looked at Grace. "We intend to rescind the suspension and offer a formal apology. We would also like to discuss an expanded leadership role in trauma response." Grace's expression did not change. "No." The president blinked. "Perhaps you would prefer to review the offer first." "No." Lila hid her mouth behind the coffee cup. Grace continued, "I came here to practice medicine, not become a symbol for damage control." The legal counsel's pen stopped moving. Shaw looked down at the table. The president chose her next words carefully. "Dr. Monroe, the institution has an obligation to learn from this. Then learn from it." Grace's voice was quiet, but the room listened. "Do not turn me into the lesson. Change the system that made it easy to dismiss a qualified surgeon because her experience did not look familiar." No one answered. Shaw finally spoke. "She is right." Several heads turned toward him. He stepped forward. "I suspended her because I confused order with judgment. I treated my discomfort with uncertainty as a patient safety concern. That was my failure." His voice was steady, but stripped of its old polish. "I will draft a revised emergency intervention policy with trauma leadership, nursing, legal, and ethics review. In immediate life-threatening circumstances, qualified physicians must be able to act when delay creates irreversible harm. Authority should support judgment, not replace it." Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to the door. "I have patients downstairs." The president said, "Dr. Monroe." Grace stopped. The president's voice softened. "Thank you." Grace did not answer with warmth or anger. She only nodded once and left. In the weeks that followed, Front Range Memorial became 2 hospitals at once. One was the public hospital, the one reporters described from the sidewalk. That hospital had controversy, anonymous sources' official statements, and images of emergency vehicles from the morning of the blast. That hospital was discussed on local news panels by people who had never seen a trauma bay at 3 in the morning. The other hospital was the real one. In the real one, nurses restocked airway carts. Residents learned to move faster without becoming careless. Families slept in chairs. Patients woke confused and alive. Burn dressings were changed. Chest tubes came out. Molly, the girl with the red boots, was extubated on a Thursday afternoon and asked for apple juice in a voice so hoarse her mother cried before answering. Grace returned to work without ceremony. No applause waited in the trauma bay. No banner, no photographer. She would have walked out if there had been. Her first full shift back began with a rollover south of the city. A teenage boy came in with a collapsed lung and a shaking father who kept asking whether he should have driven slower. Grace placed the chest tube, secured it, and told the boy when the pressure would ease. A new intern watched her with wide eyes. Afterward, he asked, "How did you know it was getting worse before the film?" Grace dropped her gloves into the bin. "His body told us." "What part?" "The part you have to learn to hear." She moved to the next patient. People treated her differently now, some with respect, some with guilt, some with an awe she did not find useful. The residents moved when she spoke. Attendings who had once questioned her became careful around her. Administrators smiled too much in hallways. Grace behaved as if none of it belonged to her. One evening, Lila found her in the supply alcove checking airway blades one by one. "You know, we have people assigned to that." Grace held a blade to the light. "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" Grace placed it back. "Because the person who needs it at 3 in the morning does not care who was assigned." Lila leaned against the doorframe. "You make common sense sound like a threat." Grace's mouth moved into the smallest smile. "It often is." The new policy took 6 weeks. Shaw worked on it harder than anyone expected. He met with nurses first, which caused more gossip than the federal letter had. He asked Lila where the chain of command failed during real emergencies. She told him. He listened without defending himself. That was new enough to make the room suspicious. He met with residents and asked when they felt afraid to speak up. Ryan answered honestly. "When the person in charge cares more about being obeyed than being informed." Shaw wrote that down. At the regional trauma conference 3 months later, Shaw presented the policy himself. The room was full. Some came for the protocol. Most came for the story. He knew that. He did not hide from it. He stood at the lectern in a dark suit and looked smaller than he used to look in the public, though perhaps only because he was no longer trying to fill the room by force. "I mistook hierarchy for wisdom," he said. The audience quieted. "I measured excellence by familiarity. I trusted the kind of record I knew how to admire. When a surgeon arrived with experience outside my frame of reference, I treated what I could not verify as what did not exist." He paused. That arrogance nearly cost lives. In the back of the room, several surgeons stopped taking notes. Shaw continued. "The purpose of authority in medicine is not to protect the person holding it. It is to protect the patient. When those two things are confused, harm follows." Grace was not there. She was in Bay 2 at front range holding pressure on a man's bleeding scalp while telling Ryan to stop apologizing to the wound and close it. Months became a year. The headlines moved on, as headlines always did. Denver repaired what could be repaired. The federal district reopened in stages. The names of the dead were read in ceremonies. The survivors became people again, not just images from a terrible morning. Agent Ethan Ward sent one note through secure channels. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Grace opened it in the break room after a night shift. Inside was a single card. "Walking slowly, thank you." No signature. Grace read it once, then placed it in her locker behind the small stack of discharge instructions she kept meaning to throw away. Lila saw her do it. That from him. Grace closed the locker. "Yes, and he is walking." Leela waited. Grace picked up her coffee. That is enough. 2 years passed before Grace decided to leave. She wrote the resignation letter at her kitchen table before sunrise in the same apartment that still looked half-temporary despite the years. The duffel bag by the door was finally empty now. A framed photograph of the trauma team sat on the shelf. A small plant Lila had forced on her somehow remained alive near the window. The letter was brief. She was grateful for the work, grateful for the staff, ready for a different kind of service. When Lila found out, she did not speak to Grace for almost 3 hours. Then she found her on the roof access landing outside the 4th floor, where hospital staff went when they needed sky more than comfort. Denver stretched below them in evening light. The mountains sat blue and distant beyond the city, steady in a way people rarely were. A cardboard box rested beside Grace. Lila looked at it. "You brought a box again." Grace nodded. "This one has more in it." Lila sat beside her. "You are really leaving?" "Yes." "Where?" "West of Boulder. Old ranch property, a barn, some acreage, enough room for training lanes." Lila stared at her. "That is not a place. That is a suspicious collection of nouns." Grace almost smiled. "I am building a response training center. For doctors. For anyone who might be first to reach a person before the system does. Rural nurses, volunteer firefighters, teachers, coaches, search teams, parents, veterans, people who need useful hands in the minutes before help arrives." Lila looked toward the mountains. "You have a name. Iron Harbor. That sounds like a place people go to get yelled at while learning to stop bleeding. It may be accurate." Lila laughed, then looked away because her eyes had filled. "You could stay. They would give you anything now." Grace watched the sunset catch the windows of the hospital. "I do not need anything they can give me. You will miss it." Grace considered that seriously. "I will miss people who kept choosing patience over politics. That is not the same as missing a place." "No." Lila wiped at her cheek with irritation. "I hate that you make sense when I want to be mad." Grace looked at her. "You can be mad." "I am?" "Good." They sat together until the sky darkened. On Grace's final shift, there was no farewell ceremony. She treated 2 fractures, one overdose, a ranch hand with a deep laceration through his palm, a grandmother with respiratory failure, and a drunk college student who insisted his wrist was not broken because he could still complain with it. At dawn, she finished her last chart and washed her hands at the trauma bay sink. Water ran over her wrists, clear from the start this time. Lila came to stand beside her. "I still hate this part." Grace dried her hands. "So do I. You could still change your mind." "I know. You will not." "Number." Lila nodded, breathing through the ache. Grace picked up her bag. At the ambulance doors, Ryan waited with his hands in his pockets. He was taller now, somehow, or maybe only steadier. "Dr. Monroe." Grace stopped. "Ryan said I matched trauma fellowship." "I heard. I think I chose it because of you." Grace looked at him long enough for him to become uncomfortable. "Choose it because of the patients. They are harder to disappoint correctly." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Grace gave him one nod and walked out into the morning. No crowd watched her leave. She did not need one. Iron Harbor stood in the foothills west of Boulder, where the air smelled of pine dust and weather moving over stone. The main building was a converted red barn with reinforced beams, wide doors, a gravel lot, and a training field that turned to mud every time the sky got serious. The sign by the gate was simple: Iron Harbor. Emergency skills for the minutes that matter. Inside the barn, trauma mannequins lay beside airway stations, bleeding control rigs. Oxygen kits, field stretchers, and shelves arranged with Grace's exact precision. No medals hung on the walls, no framed articles, no heroic photographs. There was only equipment space and work. The first class included 2 rural nurses from the western slope, 5 volunteer firefighters, a high school football coach, 3 search and rescue trainees, a former Army medic, and a mother whose son had nearly bled to death after a hunting accident while the ambulance was still 20 minutes away. Grace stood in front of them with a tourniquet in one hand. "Pressure first," she said, "panic later." No one laughed. She nodded. Good, again. She taught the way she operated. Direct, precise, without ornament. A hand placed wrong was corrected. A hesitation was named. A student moving too fast was slowed until skill replaced motion. When the room gets loud, she told them walking between practice stations get quieter inside your head. A firefighter asked, "How do you do that?" Grace tightened a training tourniquet until the simulated bleed stopped. You practice before the blood is real. By the end of the first month, word spread. Not through advertisements, through people. A sheriff's deputy used a tourniquet from Grace's class on a rollover victim outside Nederland. A school coach recognized airway obstruction during a seizure and kept a student breathing until paramedics arrived. A rural nurse packed a wound in a snowstorm while waiting for transport that took 40 minutes. They sent short messages. He lived. She made it. Your class helped. Grace printed none of them. She kept them in a drawer. One autumn afternoon, Everett Shaw drove up the gravel road to Iron Harbor. He was retired by then, though the word still sat strangely on him. He wore a plain jacket and boots that looked too new for the dirt. His hair had gone fully gray. The hard shine he used to carry had worn down into something quieter. Grace saw him from the barn doors. She was correcting a student's hand position on a junctional wound trainer. More pressure, less panic, again. The student reset. Grace looked up. Everett. He stopped near the entrance. Grace. She pointed to a bench. Class ends in 20 minutes. I can wait. I know. He did. He watched volunteer firefighters drag a litter across gravel. He watched a teenager from a search team learn chest seal placement. He watched Lila, who now visited twice a month to teach triage, terrorize a group of paramedic students with a stopwatch and a look that made them better. When the class broke, Shaw walked with Grace outside. The mountains held the late light in layers of blue and gold. You built something remarkable, he said. Grace looked toward the barn. Not alone. No, but it has your shape. She did not answer. They walked to the memorial wall near the edge of the training field. It stood beneath a simple wooden overhang, weathered and plain. Carved into the top were the words, "For the healers trusted too late." Below were names: combat medics, flight nurses, rural doctors, aid workers, field surgeons, volunteers, people who had known what to do before anyone powerful believed them. Shaw stood before it for a long time. His eyes moved line by line. This is beautiful. Grace stood beside him. It is necessary. He nodded. After a while, he said, I am writing. Grace glanced at him. A memoir would be unbearable. A surprised laugh escaped him. No, a book on leadership in medicine. Authority. Error. The stories people in charge tell themselves when they are wrong. That sounds more survivable. I want to include what happened. Not your classified history. Not what is not mine to tell, but my failure. Grace looked at the wall. Will it help someone ask a better question before dismissing the right person? I hope so. Then write it. He breathed out slowly. Do you regret it? She watched a pair of trainees across the field loading equipment into a county ambulance. Yes. Shaw waited. I regret how close people had to come to dying before anyone listened. He accepted that. And the rest. Grace folded her arms against the evening chill. I do not regret staying quiet. I regret that quiet was mistaken for empty. A bell rang from inside the barn, signaling the end of the cleanup. Students laughed tired and dusty, carrying gear back to shelves. Lila shouted at someone not to coil oxygen tubing like a garden hose. Grace turned toward the sound. Shaw looked at her. You found the exact place you were useful. Grace watched the students move. No, I found a place to make usefulness multiply. He nodded. There was nothing else to add. That evening, after everyone had gone, and the barn had settled into the small sounds of cooling metal and creaking wood, Grace stood alone at the wash station near the back door. She cleaned her hands slowly. There was no blood this time, only training residue and dust from the field. The water ran clear over the old scar on her wrist. She traced the scar once with her thumb, not with sadness, with recognition. The body kept records even when the files were sealed. Outside, the foothills had turned blue-black. Wind moved through the grass. The memorial wall stood in the fading light, names carved deep enough to hold shadow. Far down the valley, a siren rose. Grace lifted her head. The sound came thin at first, then fuller as it moved along the road below. Not dramatic, not cinematic to anyone else. Just a signal old and unmistakable. Someone was hurt. Someone was afraid. Someone needed hands more than titles. Grace turned off the water. She dried her hands, reached for the trauma bag hanging by the door, and stepped into the evening. Behind her, Iron Harbor stood quiet. Ahead, the siren called through the dark.